are as well that you are all here. Because from my perspective, there is really no issue facing all of us as a region that is more critical and more of a crisis-oriented issue than this one. And it's one of those issues that kind of creeps up on you, and all of a sudden you turn around and think, oh my God, what happened? So it's really heartening to me that you are all here, because this is government at its very best, attacking a problem and an issue before the crisis is upon us. So this is indeed worthy of our time and consideration, and worthy of our collective minds and great intuition and elaborate ingenuity to make sure that we solve this problem. We are in a very unique position in the country because we live on a very narrow peninsula with water on both sides. And in fact, in the state of California, we are ranked ground zero, which means we are the most vulnerable county in the state for sea level rise. So that alone should get our attention. Now, a few months ago, Assemblyman Rich Gordon and Supervisor Dave Pine and I hosted a sea level rise conference at the College of San Mateo. And when we first conceived of doing this, I don't know that we necessarily had a conception of how many people would come or what the interest would be. We had over 300 people who showed up at that conference. Some of you were there. And we realized that this issue was one that has grabbed the attention of our residents, and we owe them every amount of effort to make sure that we address it. So this is the second part of this effort, and that is spending time with the electeds of this region, putting our heads together, coming up with solutions and opportunities to address it. Sea level rise won't just flood our coastal areas, though it certainly will do that, but it's also going to damage our roads, back up our water treatment plants, and cause problems that we can't even envision today. So for all of your constituents that are living in high areas where they feel they're untouched by sea level rise, just remind them that virtually every sewage treatment facility in this county is located right at sea level. And if they want to flush their toilets in the next few years, we need to make sure that we address this problem. So we're all in this together, and we all have to fix it together. What we have to do is enormous. There's no question about it, but it's not that we can't do it. Now, I was flying home, driving home. I wish I were driving home. I was flying home last night and reading about an area in, I believe it was North Carolina, that has just very serious issues. And their response was quite ingenious. They decided, let me make sure I've got this right. They have all of the great areas of the Outer Banks in North Carolina. So they have lots of tourists. And so they're very vulnerable as well. And so they looked at this issue, and they realized that it was really big. And so what they did is stick their heads in the sand. And rather than recognize that there is this potential for a minimum of 3 feet of sea level rise, they just decided to say, we're not going to see more than 20 inches in the next 30 years. And so we're only going to plan for 20 inches in the next 30 years. And literally overturned a planning process that was underway. We're not going to do that here, because we're not stupid. And we're not from North Carolina. But in any case, that's the difference between red states and blue states, I might add. But I'm not getting political. I'm just trying to have a little fun this morning. So We have a great program ahead of you, and we're all going to be able to participate. And we've brought back John Englander, who is really the expert on this issue. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rich Gordon.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Good morning. I am really pleased to be here, and I'm pleased that all of you are here. It is imperative that we start to work together, plan together, coordinate together for what is an inevitability. Our seas have already risen and will continue to rise over the next century. And we are vulnerable, as the Congresswoman said, so it is imperative that we get to work. And that's what today is about. I've had the privilege over the last year and a half of chairing a select committee on sea level rise for the California State Assembly. We are about ready to issue our final report. We'll make sure you get copies of that. But we have, one of our key findings was that there is efforts going on across the state in various places, but there is not necessarily a coordinated effort. And there is not a central database, and there's been no thought about what are we going to do as we have to start to actually do physical adaptation and make changes to our infrastructure in order to accommodate the rising seas. I had so one of the ideas that my staff and I came up with was that in the state budget, there's no money at all for any category for sea level rise. So we said, well, what we should do is create at least a line item. So we drafted budget language. I worked it through the budget committee, and it created a line item for planning around sea level rise, with funding going to the Coastal Conservancy, BCDC, and the Coastal Commission. Although when I wrote the language, we put a $0 sign behind it because we know that Governor Brown is very frugal and was not going to fund anything new. Well, sometimes strange things happen in Sacramento. Well, actually, frequently strange things happen in Sacramento. And so the budget goes to the conference committee of the two houses for discussion. And State Senator Mark Leno, who sits on that committee, said, hey, there's this line item here around sea level rise. He said, I think that's new. Where'd that come from? And he said, but there's no money. He said, we need money there. $250 million was placed into that line item by Mark Leno. And I don't know whether the governor just missed it, but when he signed the budget, that stayed in. So now in California, for the very first time, we do have some money for planning. And there will be a process set up in San Mateo County and its cities. Will be eligible to receive some funding to do the work that you're going to talk about today. Now, we want to get to that work, so I don't really want to say much more. I do want to apologize, but I'm going to be leaving a little bit early and won't be here for, I'm actually on the agenda, I think, concluding remarks. I won't be here for that part, so I'll conclude now by saying thank you for the work you did. This has been a very productive conference. I will explain that it turns out that at the last minute, the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee will be in my district this morning, and we need to talk to her about some more money for transportation activities and for our needs in this region. So I'm going to go do that work while you finish up this work, but I applaud you for what you've accomplished today. And now let me turn it over to my friend and our colleague, County Supervisor Dave Pine.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's terrific you could all join us today. I just wanted to take a couple minutes and just kind of outline the program for this morning and talk about some of the objectives for our convening. So we're going to begin with about an hour of presentations from a series of individuals. And let me just briefly introduce them now. Our first speaker will be John Englander, who, as Congressman Spear mentioned, was our keynote speaker back in December. And he is a leading expert on sea level rise and is the author of a book I would recommend called High Tide on Main Street. He will be followed by two individuals from Washington who will actually video conference in. They are Robert Meltz and Francis McCarthy. They're analysts with the Library of Congress Congressional Research Service. We also are happy to have Dick Santos from the Santa Clara Valley Water District. They have a unique vehicle there for dealing with flood control issues, and it'll be helpful for us to hear from him. And we're also pleased to have Zach Wasserman, who is the chair of BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and he and John will speak about one of three key concepts we really want your feedback on today. And that first concept is, can we or should we adopt as a planning concept, as a planning paradigm, that the sea level will rise 3 feet in the Bay Area sometime in this century? What does that mean? Does that help us? So after these presentations, we'll take a few questions, but what's so important about this convening today is we really are eager to hear people's views about this issue and about these three topics. And again, the topics are planning for 3 feet of sea level rise, preparing a valuable vulnerability assessment for San Mateo County, both on the Bay Shore and the coast side, and thinking about local options for planning and financing the work that we will need to do in the years ahead. So we're going to have breakout groups. Everyone has a number on their name tag, which we'll assign to your breakout group. We'll give you more detail on that. So the groups will come back. We'll hear what you had to hear about your discussions, and then we'll conclude with some ideas about how to go forward. So this conference is very different than the one we had previously in that the input that you have to share and your thoughts are just critical to the success of today's gathering. So with that, let me turn it over to John Englander, who will give us the basics of sea level rise. Mr. Englander.
While she's doing that, Jackie, you actually gave North Carolina a bit of a planning boost there. What they said was that for the next 100 years, sea level could only rise, or plans can only be made based upon the last century. So it's 8 inches for the century is what they decided was a good baseline for anything connected with state of North Carolina planning. And actually, the governor wound up pushing that back and saying for 4 years, we'll use that. It's a transition to allow them to wake up to the reality, I think. It's a pleasure to be back here. I think this is my 6th trip in 12 months. I live in Florida. If you think you have it bad, you should live in a state that's mostly about 5 feet above sea level and is porous limestone, and seawalls won't keep the water out. And well, that's gallows humor. And I do a lot of keynotes and workshops and consulting for people in South Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and it's seriously a much more challenging situation there. But every area with sea level rise is different. And it's not just the coastal areas from the Bay Area to Florida. It's areas on tidal rivers like Sacramento. And the impacts, if ports go underwater, and not beyond the permanent going underwater as sea level rise, is as sea level rises, it raises the base, and the king tides and the storm surges have a higher base. So we have both, if you will, the baseline sea level, but we also have those intermittent problems that all get raised up. And what people don't stop to think about is that while they all combine, storms, tides, and sea level rise, that a storm recedes in days at most. And an extreme tide, you call them king tides out here, recedes in hours. Sea level rise cannot go down or reverse for centuries, actually 1,000 years or more. So that's why it's a daunting problem. And it's a particularly daunting problem because we have no human experience with this. Sea level has not changed much in 5,000 years, And the last time it was higher than now was 120,000 years ago. And it's worth remembering that because it puts in context why we just have trouble believing it's going to happen. And yet it starts with a natural geologic cycle. Now we've changed that cycle, but it's one of the things I'm going to quickly do is put in context the natural cycle, which is always the question, how much of this is man-caused and how much is natural? Well, it turns out we've broken out of the natural cycle. And so one of the things I do is juxtapose those two things and help people see what's natural and what's human-induced. It's pretty clear that for every foot of rise that the sea goes inland, but it's counterintuitive perhaps that for every foot of rise, the global average is about 300 feet horizontal. Now, if you think about it, out in the Pacific, it's less than 300 to 1 because it's a steep shore, whereas here in Redwood City, Foster City, and places like that, which are flat fill land that were just brought above sea level because we didn't think it was a problem, that when you get to a critical height, it's almost like a flat table, which is why you're so concerned, and rightly so here. Again, we need to contrast storms. When we have a unique storm like a Sandy event, which hits at an unusually high tide, a king tide, that we know what that does. We've seen that example. And the fact that we're here and repeatedly here, I mean, is testament to your professionalism, your responsibility, and it starts at the federal level, the state, the county, and here with the cities. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited to come back here so often, because you're on the leading edge, and you have that attitude here. And I'm going to tell you, Florida, where I live, has a different attitude. It's not nearly as progressive. Maybe it's partly because of the vulnerability, but it's a different attitude. And I admire you for it, and it's exciting to come here and see a group that wants to tackle the problem. You see king tides regularly, and they've always been there, but they're happening more frequently. There are streets in coastal areas all over the world where they design storm drains, and the storm drains are put there to take excess rainfall or runoff and take it to some waterway, right? Well, every 28 days, the water backs up now. Some months worse than others, depending upon the alignment of the planets, but that's salt water coming back up through the storm drain. Miami Beach has just bought 800 flapper valves to put on all the storm drains so that in October, which will be the peak month for their king tide, we don't call it that in Florida, but that the water hopefully will not back up onto the streets, because the new mayor, Phil Levine, campaigned and said, if you elect me in October, the streets will not flood. And the city engineers are just scared that they can pull this off. They bought hundreds of millions of dollars of pumps, and they bought 800 flapper valves to try and cap those storm drains. So what are the facts? And I'm going to be very quick here. I'm going to cut out the humor and the normal things I do to kind of loosen people up, but and elaborate on things. If you want to get more detail, buy my book. It's available as an ebook. I'll be back out in here in September doing some work for the Port of San Francisco, but this is an ongoing discussion and we all have to get our heads around it. But very briefly, to give you some quick facts, and during the latter part of this morning, there'll be opportunities to answer questions. And to put this in context, 2 days ago, Dr. Mark Trexler, who's here, and I did 3 hours of this for the Port of San Francisco, the Bay Planning Coalition. Sea level has risen 8 inches in the last century. What's hard to put in context is that it's been pretty flat for 5,000 years. That's a graph showing sea level since the last ice age. It rose 390 feet, and sometimes very suddenly, a natural effect, and got to the present height about 5,000 years ago. That's all of human civilization in that 5,000 years. That's why we have trouble believing it's going to change. But that's a natural cycle. There's enough ice on the planet to raise sea level 212 feet. Partly Greenland, 24 feet, Antarctic, 186, 2 or 3 feet for all the glaciers in the world, and then thermal expansion. As the oceans warm, they do get a little bit taller, a couple of inches. I'm going to skip ahead here. I'm running long, which I tend to do. The polar ice cap, the biggest misunderstanding about sea level rise is thinking that the polar ice cap melting, which we all get concerned about polar bears and things like that, relates to sea level rise. It doesn't, just like ice cubes in a glass, floating ice is 10% above the surface, but it has no impact on the level. If you think about a glass of iced tea, if you didn't drink anything out of it, as the ice cubes melted, it would not affect the level because of Archimedes' principle. What it does prove is that we're in a different era. The polar ice cap has been frozen for 3 million years. It will be ice-free for a few weeks starting in September in the next few years. They're planning shipping routes across the pole. If anybody says, oh, this has happened before, this is a natural cycle. It's been 3 million years since the pole has been ice-free. It's going to happen in our lifetime. That's a physical proof of temperature change. The ice on the planet responds to long-term temperature. It's usually a 100,000-year cycle. It is now happening at hyperspeed. You can look at numbers different ways. This is a graph of the last 40 years of global average temperature. This is a NASA graph. Some people would selectively get you to look at one of the 6 blue lines and saying the rate of temperature increase is slowing or reversing. It's a stair-step function. There's some reasons for that, and I can't get into it here today. But if you look at the 40-year red line, you can see where temperatures are headed. If somebody says, well, let's look at the last 17 years, it's slowing down, it's reversing, it's flattened out, it's doing these things. We all know you can pick a data set and get the proof you want, whether it be investments or anything else, right? Look at the long-term picture. Looking at the long-term picture, 400,000 years of sea level rise, it goes up and down in a regular pattern, 350 feet every 100,000 years. We got fooled because we were at the top, we were at the turning point after 20,000 years of rise and about to start 80,000 years of fall. The best single graph, and I'd be glad to share this with you to help you explain this to your constituencies or other people, is this single graph which shows 400,000 years of sea level at the bottom in blue, red is global average temperature, and green is a greenhouse gas carbon dioxide. The amazing thing about this graph is that all 3 of those lines essentially line up. The peaks all are on top of each other. That's not an accident. There's some simple physics why, not enough time now to get into it. But the problem is in the upper right, in the little ellipse, that carbon dioxide is broken out of the 180 to 280 parts per million range and is now at 400, and the others will follow. We know that data from ice cores. Time is out, so I will get to talk to you probably during your breakout groups later this morning. Thank you for being interested in this. This seems simple. Is that right? Okay, thanks. I've been given a reprieve. Thank you. Let me back up there. One of the things that's worth noting is that the official estimates, and the best official source would be the IPCC. Every 5 or 6 years, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gives a report. The National Climate Assessment just came out within the last 12 months, the National Research Council. Those official reports tend to understate the problem, and it's worth understanding why. Because a lot of planning is based upon their numbers. They say in the latest report that we're going to get 10 to 32 inches of sea level rise this century. They're not telling us the probability, and they're not telling us the worst case. They're answering a different question, and very few people understand the difference. They're answering a question of, based upon the current science, what do we know will happen this century that we can quantify based upon articles in peer-reviewed literature? And the way they get to 10 to 32 inches, they take the thermal expansion of seawater, the melting of glaciers, and what's going on in Greenland now, and add those things up. And that gets to 10 to 32 inches. What that emits is the uncertainties. And the biggest one is a place in West Antarctica. And it has the potential to cause a lot more sea level rise than all those other things combined. But because we don't know how quickly it's going to collapse, to not scare people and to, frankly, not to be responsible, they don't put that in the numbers because they can't quantify it. But it's in the notes. And if you read the text, you say, the uncertainty is for several more feet. So that's why it's exciting, not exciting, well, it is exciting that you're here and broaching the question of how do you plan for a very vulnerable area on the inshore here particularly, and as well as the erosion potential that will be exacerbated on the Pacific. How do you plan intelligently for a problem that may not manifest in our lifetimes? But just as people built structures and infrastructure and planned a century ago, and we're still using those assets, bridges, tunnels, streets, utilities, we have an opportunity, we have a responsibility, I think, to think ahead. This is a strange problem because it's not dramatic like a tsunami or an earthquake. And you have the advantage here of planning for events. You don't know when the next earthquake's going to happen, but you accept and you build for it. This is the same kind of thing. But here we know it's going to happen because the warmer ocean dictates that sea level will eventually get 3 feet, then 4 feet, then 5 feet, and into the next century, much higher. The uncertainty is the problem. But as some of us are going to suggest to you today, 3 feet's a good place to start. It's big, but it's doable. And once we start planning for 3 feet, we can start thinking about what's beyond that. But if we keep thinking a couple of inches at a time, we'll never see where this is headed. The vulnerability is in West Antarctic, and I will flip through here. The last slide is just to show that the projections are low. This is the last 20 years. In green and blue are the projections from the IPCC for sea level. The red line is the smoothed out trend line, and the gold is the actual sea level for the last 20 years. The actual sea level exceeded or was at the top of the projections just for the last 2 decades. That's the same group that's telling us we should plan on 10 to 32 inches this century. Okay, the estimate, it's not because of incompetence, it's not because they're trying to lowball it, it's just, as I explained earlier, their scientific methodology leaves the uncertainties off the table. But it means that when there's a projection of 10 to 32 inches, we should plan for that to happen sooner, which is exactly what we're here talking about today. This is not the end of the world, and I would just encourage you to take examples from a few places in the world that have had to deal with this over the years, like the Dutch. And this is an example. If we think big and bold, we can have a very livable city. This is a town in Vlissingen in the Netherlands, and by thinking boldly, they designed an entire city that can cope with a 20-foot storm surge or sea level rise in different levels. But we've got to think ahead, which is exactly what your elected leaders here are encouraging us all to do. So thank you.
All right, now we attempt the high-tech video conferencing, which we think will work, to introduce 2 speakers from Washington.
As we're connecting here, Robert Meltz works for the Congressional Research Service. He is an attorney that concentrates on land use planning issues, government taking, all the kinds of questions that we would hear from our local constituents on this issue. And I think he'll be very helpful to us in just being able to put our arms around what the complicated nature of all this is. Yeah. Sure. While we're waiting to get him on.
Yes, I know that some of the things I said, I got a couple of people cocking their heads while Marion's getting Skype up. Is there anything to clarify? Yes.
Just real quick, the triple map show,
Yes.
is that available online? Or?
It's on my blog, and you can, there's a couple of posts about it, but if you just send me an email and my stuff's easy to find, I'll be glad to send it to you.
Can we get a copy of your presentation?
Yes, I'll make it available through the county's office.
At your last presentation, you talked about marshland as being a good mitigator in part. You haven't commented on that today. In terms of the 32 inches, how much of marshland is that going to take?
Let's deal with that a little bit later this morning, now that we've got people online. Thanks.
Good morning, Robert. All right.
Should I start?
Yes, you should start. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you, at least electronically. I want to, at Congresswoman Spears' request, I'm going to address the property rights implications of sea level rise in California, and then some of the issues that may arise under the takings clauses of the federal and California constitutions, those two clauses being similarly construed by the courts. A couple of caveats. There are no court decisions dealing with sea level rise caused by climate change, and so it's not necessarily certain how the courts will apply principles developed up till now in this very new context. And secondly, takings law can be rather vague and heavily fact-dependent, so predicting whether a given situation constitutes a taking as a general matter is certainly a risky venture. So let me turn first to some property rights implications. In California, as in most coastal states, the state owns permanently submerged offshore lands and tide lands, that is lands between the mean low tide mark and the mean high tide mark, owing largely to the public trust doctrine in California. And the shorefront property owner owns from the mean high tide mark landward. So the question comes up whether a shift in the mean high tide mark causes the ownership line, the property line between the state and the beachfront owner, often legally called the littoral owner, causes that property line to move with the mean high tide mark. The old rule followed in California and every coastal state I'm aware of is that whether the property line moves with the mean high tide mark depends on whether the movement in the mean high tide mark is gradual, in which case the ownership line does move, or sudden, in which case the property line does not move. Scholarly writing I've seen seems to have some confidence that when courts eventually do have to face this issue, that they're likely to hold that the climate change-induced sea level rise falls into the gradual category, so that the state's public trust ownership will move up the beach to the detriment of the littoral owner. But there's certainly a possibility that courts will reason that the rule of migrating property lines is inappropriate to climate change-caused sea level rise. Courts, I can imagine, could say, well, you know, that common law rule of migrating property lines made sense in a world where sometimes the mean high tide mark moves landward, so the littoral owner loses, and sometimes the mean high tide mark moves seaward, so the littoral owner gains. But with climate change caused sea level rise, the movement is all in one direction. The beachfront owners only lose land, and this is exactly the kind of new circumstance that classically has caused the common law to evolve. And even if common law courts don't abandon the traditional rule entirely, they may decline to apply it in certain circumstances with certain special circumstances. So let me turn now to takings implications. And the question is, would a taking requiring compensation of the property owner result from the transfer of ownership from the private owners to the state as the mean high tide mark moves landward? There is a strong argument, I believe, that no taking would result. The littoral owners would not be compensated, at least for a taking. The argument is that land is acquired subject to the common law restrictions in effect at the time of acquisition, and the rule of migrating boundaries has been around forever in California, and so just about everybody in California would have acquired when that rule was part of California law. And of course, subsequent to the property being acquired, the state did not do anything to affect the transfer. It was the result of sea level rise. And in my last minute or so, I'd like to mention some other takings issues raised by sea level rise, other than the issues from migrating property boundaries. There's four I want to touch on. One, would a ban on hard armoring, like seawalls and bulkheads, would that be a taking by virtue of prohibiting the property owner from taking steps that might keep his or her property from eroding into the sea? Um, some evidence not, but not clearly in California. Would harm, and the opposite situation, would hard armoring where it's allowed stop the state's public trust rights from continuing to move landward to where they would have been had the seawall not been built? This was addressed a few years ago by the Ninth Circuit. Second issue, would a taking result from a local government's strict prohibition on development on parcels likely to be flooded or eroded away? That's very fact dependent. Three, would a taking result from the government's decision to stop maintaining a shoreline road or a bridge that was the only access to a private parcel? And fourth and last, would a taking result from the government's failure to construct facilities adequate to protect private property from sea level rise? I think there's a pretty strong argument here that it would not, based on the California and other case law. So anyway, these are some of the questions that the courts are going to have to wrestle with in future years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Frank.
Good morning. I'm Frank McCarthy, an analyst in emergency management policy at the Congressional Research Service. I appreciate this time with you today, and I want to thank Representative Spear for inviting our participation today. For full disclosure, I should point out I've been at CRS almost 8 years, but preceded that with a 25-year career at FEMA as well. Very briefly, I want you to provide
Opposed?
They're back.
Yeah, if, again, since Zach Wasserman.
This addresses one of your taking
Stand
comments.
up so you can be in the.
And could people remind them to speak into the mic for the recording?
This addresses one of your taking comments. Do you have any thoughts about the lawsuit by the insurance companies in Chicago, which was filed and I think then withdrawn, on the failure to take steps to protect from storm damage?
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I don't see that the government, again, this is so filled with factual nuance that as a general matter, the government does not have a legal obligation to be the guarantor of total safety to people living in the jurisdiction. I mean, this came up, and nor by doing something does the government have the obligation to ensure that it be 100% adequate in all circumstances. This came up following the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. There was a lawsuit brought against the Corps of Engineers by the folks who were flooded, saying, well, that levee you built wasn't high enough, so you're liable for taking it. The court said, well, the Corps of Engineers, by having built the project, did not guarantee that it was going to be adequate in all circumstances. The taking, if any, was by forces of nature and not by the government. So I don't want to go much further because there may be peculiarities of state law involved here, and I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. But I think that's about as far as I can go without looking into nuances of state law.
We get one more question, if there is one. Well, seeing none, let's bring the focus back to the local level. I think we all know that it's hard to look to Washington for relief these days. And we will now turn to a brief presentation from Dick Santos of the Santa Clara Valley Water District. Santa Clara Valley has a very different organization and funding mechanism for dealing with flood control compared to San Mateo County, so your perspective, Dick, will be valuable. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Richard Santos, Director of Santa Clara Valley Water District. And welcome to ladies and gentlemen and all the honorable elected officials. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our staff because they're going to be here today to answer any questions. So please stand up so you can recognize our staff. Right in the front row. They're here to make me look good and answer questions, so thank you. I represent East Sunnyvale, all of Alviso, and Berryessa, and the northern part of Santa Clara, and the rest of San Jose. So this gives some background about the Water District. We were created back in 1929 to support water for agriculture, and today we serve 2 million people, residents, commuters, in 15 cities. The Water District provides wholesale water to 13 retailers who use the groundwater basins that we actively manage. We have 10 reservoirs, 3 pumping plants, and 1 purification plant. To deliver drinking water directly to the homes of businesses throughout the county. We also have 4,700 well owners. We have around 740 plus employees, and we have 7 elected directors. The Water District was formed to manage the water system that adjusts to meet the rising population and changing needs of our region. Over the years, the district has developed a comprehensive water resource management agency in order to meet the growing, increasingly complex needs of the residents and businesses in the community. In addition, we protect property from flooding and residents. The district has invested over $1 billion in flood protection programs. This includes both large-scale flood protection projects and the annual stream maintenance activities that the district carries out every year to prepare local waterways to carry floodwaters away from the homes and businesses. As part of our environmental services and responsibilities, we remove mercury, toxins, contaminants, sediment, homeless camps, and so on that's left behind. So we do a lot of work. We have over 4 inspections every year in our creeks and waterways. At the same time, we fund continuous volunteers to remove all the trash, and we pay for it. So we do a heck of a job, and it's very difficult. Back in 1952, the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors formed the Santa Clara County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. The goals were to protect our county from flooding and supplement local water supply with water imported from the outside valley. In 1968, the Santa Clara Valley Water Conservation District and the Santa Clara County Flood Control and Water Conservation District merged together and forming one agency, which we are today. So what is the Santa Clara Valley's interest in the flood protection? The district manages approximately 800 miles of creeks in Santa Clara County to ensure that there is a healthy and safe environment for residents, businesses, and visitors, as well as for our future generations. For the fiscal years of 2015 and 19, we have a total of 65 priority projects to implement the goals and objectives of the district's program plans and master plans. Those 65 projects include water supply, buildings and grounds improvements, information technology, capital improvements, and flood protection projects. Out of the 65 total projects, 17 are flood protection projects. And when we do all these projects, we hire many, many people and create many, many jobs, and we have a major impact on our Santa Clara County economy. After 50 years of working for flood protection, we have significantly reduced the intensity and the frequency of flooding in Santa Clara County. Since the early 1980s, the district has invested more than $1 billion in flood protection and protected more than 97,000 properties from 1% of the 100-year flood. And folks, I'm an example. I was born and raised in Alviso. In 1955 as a young person. In 1958, 1983 as an adult, I lost everything I owned to floods. So I understand it, and we want to make sure it doesn't happen to anybody again. That's why we take the sea level rise and everything else very seriously. The voters of Santa Clara County have supported the district's flood protection efforts by approving benefit assessments funding in 1982, 1986, and 1990. The voters approved the special partial tax in the year 2000 to fund the continuation of our district's flood protection capital improvements. In November of 2012, the voters overwhelmingly approved, it's called the Safe Clean Water Natural Flood Protection Program, basically a continuation. The Safe Clean Water program includes funding for the important water utility project, as well as the additional funding for flood projects and water resources stewardship projects. The Safe Clean Water program will provide a total of $548 million of special partial tax revenues for capital projects. Additionally, we have a robust partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state of California. And that relationship continues going thanks to Mr. Gordon and our Congresswoman Spear. Let's have an overview of the San Francisco Quito Flood Protection Ecosystem Restoration and Recreation Project. One of the key flood projects that demonstrates the importance of regional partnerships is solving the complex flooding and ecosystem restoration projects in the San Francisco Quito project. Now, if you could say San Francisco Quito 3 times in a row, you're better than I am. But anyway, we get the cities together of Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, and Menlo Park, and is located in both the Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. The San Francisco Quito Water District, San Mateo County Flood Control District, was formed in 1998 to address the flooding issues that happened in 1998. The goals of the project are to protect properties and infrastructure from the San Francisco Bay to the Searsville Dam from the 100-year flood 1% event. The current project is located in the 100-year protection from riverine flooding with 10-year tide. However, the shoreline project is to prevent flooding from the 100-year tidal flooding with projected sea level rise, and also initiated on both the Santa Clara County and San Mateo County shorelines. All of these projects are important to ensure that this area is adequately protected from future flooding. The first project just recently received approval of full funding from all the cities and the various JP Powers and Santa Clara Valley Water District. The project, which stretches from Bay 101, will provide 100-year protection from flooding to the most vulnerable downstream communities. This is the first step necessary in providing flood protection from the 100-year flood in the San Francisco-Quito Creek watershed that sets the tone to successful partnership in the future. So what is the district's interest in the shoreline and sea level rise? The Santa Clara County's shoreline is at great risk from flooding, now due to the extreme storm events combined with high tides in the future due to the sea level rise. Global climate change has the potential to impact South Bay because one of the expected results of climate change is sea level rise. The shoreline study is a first study of its kind in the Bay Area to develop a concrete plan to provide flood risk management in light of sea level rise in the Bay. The South San Francisco Bayline Short Study is a congressional authorized study for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with the Santa Clara Valley Water District and the State Coastal Conservancy to identify and recommend flood protection ecosystem restoration project in South San Francisco. And of course, we need continually federal funding. The project is completed. It will create the largest restored wetland west coast of the United States with extensive habitat for federal endangered species, migratory birds, and enhanced public access. Number 2 is protect the sea from the just over 2 feet of sea level rise. Protect urban areas next to South San Jose, including the area and houses of much of our high-tech community, and the tidal flooding, including our San Jose, Santa Clara flood control pollution plant. Provide for enhanced public trails and recreation opportunities. The project will fix the existing federally owned salt pond levees, which are about 16,000 acres. And that is some beautiful protected lands and endangered species, and that's subject to sea level rise. The study is assessing flood risk for all Santa Clara County baylands from Palo Alto to southern Alameda County. It also considered restoration of former salt ponds within the Alviso area. So how much will the shore, excuse me. Currently, the study is being conducted in different phases. The current phase focuses on a section of the Santa Clara County shoreline that will exhibit the greatest flood risk in the future due to sea level rise. The North San Jose shoreline between Alviso Slough and the Coyote Creek, which includes the Alviso community and the San Jose, Santa Clara pollution control plant. And later on, you'll see the map, I believe it's up there. It's talked about the economic impact it will have on all that area. Ultimately, the project will rely on federal participation from the Army Corps of Engineers to review and support the plans, and to say that the federal government should continue involvement with this project. In our Safe Clean Water program, we included a total of $20 million for the shoreline effort, $15 million for the Alviso area planning study, and $5 million to start planning for the Palo Alto down to the South Bay. Without federal participation, the district cannot implement additional planning, design, and construction due to the limited funding that we all face. And of course, in Alviso, we're trying to restore it back the way it was in 1852, which is very hard to remove the non-native vegetation, but bringing the salt water back to the way it was in 1983. So in closing, we're moving forward is still in need of support. And that's why we're here. We need to get all together in a collaborative forum. It's not just one voice, it's all of us together to make sure, again, federal funding, it's always about funding. But if we work together and send the letters and so on and get together, we can all get this challenge done. That's why we have a delegation we have twice a year. We go to D.C. and we sit down with Congresswoman Jackie Spear and everybody else and saying, hey, we need funding to make sure that this is a safer place for our next generation and facing this dangerous sea level rise. With that, thank you. If there are hard questions, they're right here. It's easy.
I'd like just to make a comment and really extend my thanks to the Santa Clara Valley Water District. One of the 5 board members on the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority, and that's the creek that divides Santa Clara and San Mateo. And in 1998, there was a severe storm event, and there was, tens of millions of dollars of damage. East Palo Alto today, if you walk on the levees where the creek is, you're looking down on the homes. And the people in East Palo Alto are at great risk as we speak to a storm event. So the first part of the construction was from 101 to the bay. We have work to do upstream. But it's about a $37 million project. And the money, most of the money came from a grant from the state, if I remember about $10 million, and then a substantial contribution by the Santa Clara Valley Water District. And then East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and the County of San Mateo, we kicked in some money as well. But we don't have a Santa Clara Valley Water District. We don't have a way, it was very difficult for us to get that project done because we don't have a counterpart to what they have in Santa Clara Valley. So just one question, can you just briefly describe how where your revenue comes from and how much money you're able to put towards flood control, which of course is, you have an enormous operation to provide water, but the focus of course is flood control. If you could just give a quick summary of that.
Well, besides the federal funding and state funding, subvention funds and so on, we had the 2 measures of 2000 and 2012. And the people in Santa Clara County gave us a 74% rating, which is unheard of. But that trust, we in turn invest back in the promises that we made about the projects, we deliver. That's why we have our staff here, the expertise to help out and answer these questions, and of course, help you all do the same thing we're trying to do with solving this problem. But anyway, that trust has been proven to work out. And then we got, like I said, this last one, we got $20 million alone just for the shoreline study, which the people of Santa Clara County bestowed upon us, which we appreciate.
Which is your local match for the federal funds. A quick question or two before we go to our next speaker. All right, thank you, Mr. Santos. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up the portion of the program where we're presenting a lot of information. And the next segment is really an important one. And John Englander and Zach Wasserman are going to speak to the idea of adopting a planning paradigm of planning for 3 feet of sea level rise. So I will turn it over to Zach Wasserman and Mr. Englander.
Good morning, all. I'm going to make a brief presentation and then turn it back over to John. The Bay Conservation and Development Commission is engaged on what we describe as a campaign over a 5 to 10 year period to determine in the Bay Area what we can do to adapt to rising sea levels, what we should do taking into account reasonable priorities and, to the extent we can, unintended consequences, and then, of course, how we're going to pay for it. Arguably, we're about 2 years into this campaign. The Commission has a rising sea level working group that has been gathering information from a variety of sources in industry and government and education, and even some political consultants on how to think about that and how to formulate it. We hope that working group will have a report to the Commission in September, and that will be more or less the formal kickoff of the campaign. And one of the critical issues that we are grappling with, in addition to the very complex technical and scientific issues, and actually I want to pause and thank the Congresswoman for what I think is an ingenious phrase, elaborate ingenuity. I think is the phrase that she used. And I think we're going to have a lot of that in order to address this problem, because of course there's not going to be any one solution. Some places will have seawalls. Some places will have dikes. Some places will have just more earth. There was some reference in a question, I think. Some places we're going to address it through extended marshes. And we know that we're going to have to think outside the box. Amongst the things we're going to have to do in order to save our bay is, in fact, in places to fill it. As you may know, the primary mission of our commission is to avoid any unnecessary fill, to only approve fill when it's absolutely necessary, when there can't be an upland use. But there are areas where we're going to have to put things into the bay in order to save the bay and save our land around it and our built environment. A lot of what we're going to have to do is figure out how to educate not only ourselves, the sort of government and industry people who are thinking about it, but the public at large. And that in particular, I think, is where this concept of 3 feet becomes very important, because we've got to get into people's minds in a way that they can accept and start dealing with and help us deal with how to adapt to this problem. And that takes a whole range of things to do. When you look at that map and you look at the maps outside and you really think about it, you almost understand what they do in North Carolina. Because it's very hard to grapple. It's very hard to conceive. It's very hard to hold in your mind. And when we scientifically talk about 16 to 55 inches, that's hard to get into your mind, and it's sort of easy to ignore. We think, and John is going to talk more about the scientific basis for it, that talking about 3 feet as a model, talking about 3 feet as a concept, talking about 3 feet as a label, is a way to get people to start thinking. You can go out and see what would 3 feet look like when we hit the shoreline here. And of course that needs to be translated, as John says, potentially here into 900 feet inland. We're underwater. We're walking in water right here. Unless, of course, we do something. And if we wait 10, 15, 25, 50 years until it really happens, it will be way too late. That solution will only be we're all living on boats. I don't think it's going to work real well. It certainly will not work for our airports in terms of landing planes. So the point here is using an educational concept, using it. We're not going to take it away from the scientists. We're not trying to stop the research. But it is a way for us to communicate to ourselves and the general public, this is real, it's a concrete concept, and there are ways we can deal with it. With that, I'll turn it over to John to talk about the more scientific approach to it.
Thanks, Zach, and I'll be brief. I know we're kind of running late, and we want to give you plenty of time for discussion and work groups here. But I guess to reinforce that and build upon what I said earlier, why 3 feet? And maybe if we do all the right things, we won't have to do that. No. 3 feet is already locked in. In fact, it's more than that. 3 feet is the first target or threshold that I and others here think is a good planning horizon. Planning horizon doesn't mean you build to it tomorrow, but it gets you thinking bigger. Because if we just keep thinking 6 inches at a time, we'll never see where this is headed. You can build a 10-story building a floor at a time if you build the right foundation, right? If you only can afford to build 1 story, but you know you're going to build a 10-story building, you'll build the right foundation. If you build a 1-story building and then need to add floors, you have to tear it down because the foundation's inadequate. It's a simple metaphor to think about, that if we can see where this is headed, we can think boldly, like that slide I showed you from the Netherlands, where they said, let's design a city that will withstand North Sea storms. But as proof of the importance of planning, I didn't show it in this short presentation, but I often showed the gates of Rotterdam Harbor. You may have seen those giant semicircular gates that close, $1 billion. They now realize it was an inadequate design, because when they were designed 30 or 40 years ago, they allowed for a foot of sea level rise. The real design was against North Sea storms and river flooding coming down the rivers. And now the Dutch, who are masters of this, realize that that design is inadequate, because when they designed it 30 years ago, they didn't think sea level could rise 3, 4, or 5 feet this century. So we all have lessons to learn, and here's the simple facts. The oceans are 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were a century ago. That's a measurable fact. As the temperature of the planet changes over long term, that's years and decades, the amount of ice changes. Warmer planet means the ice is getting smaller. I showed you photos. As the ice sheets get smaller, sea level rises, third fact. And as sea level rises, the shoreline moves inland. Those four facts are incontrovertible. They start with a measurable 1.5 degrees warmer. And what that proves scientifically is that the ice will keep getting smaller with a lag time. We don't know what that is because we've never warmed this quickly. We are warming hundreds of times faster than in the last 500 million years. If the models are imprecise and unproven, it is what it is. We have to deal with it. And